what about the depth side of it? I kind of hinted at it already. But the depth comes with the surprising interactions among the races and religions that are sort of found in the way they're written and refer to one another. So that, for example, the forester and the hillfolk human cultures, their religions are actually surprisingly compatible with and repurposed from one of the elven religions. And so there's these interesting interactions, there's relationships among the different, fairy folk. Oh yes, and there's a whole set of races. God, it just keeps going, doesn't it? There's a whole set of races who are kind of the bad guys in fantasy role playing. So you've got your goblins, you got your ratlings, you got your hobbs who are orcs, and a bunch of others, and they are such an underclass. They are so the flotsam and jetsam and the laborers and it's really striking. Then you look at their religions and they just leap out at you. The desire to play a goblin, the desire to play a hob, the desire to play a ratling, and the fact that they all have sort of end runs around the requirements for magic so that those characters can end up being more magical and in sort of the darker side of magic. The key here is that your profile of player characters will really set the precise nature of what fantasy means for this game. We had a wolfling who's kind of a, not really a werewolf, but hey, all right, a werewolf. And an elf, which in this game is pretty human, pretty almost kind of bourgeois, actually. And then you have, the elf, the really elfy elves are the she. But anyway, so I'm playing kind of like, person elf. And then you have the hillfolk person, who, as I say, is pretty much, as Rod said, my God, she's smoking a corncob pipe. And so the three of those set up a particular array of context, which generated what fantasy means for us. And the setting, which although it looks incredibly superficial in terms of its map and so forth, but it is true that when you set up a group of player characters and then you look around on the map, it's remarkably easy to realize where you are, which is, again, this strange mix of what looks like whimsy to the point of idiocy, and then all of a sudden in terms of play. And what we're doing here and what we're about to do is much more functional than one could anticipate. Okay, so what if we had, a different thing? What if instead of, a hillfolk person, we had, something a little more, fantastical, high fantasy-ish, like one of the avian people, who's basically, a human with wings. They don't have bird faces or something, but therefore you would have these two kind of half humans and an elf, and the whole thing would sort of shift into a much more high fantasy-ish mode. And then you would have other combinations. In one of the games that I played, we had an Easterling, a Serpentine, and a Brownie, and it was a much more exotic inventor kind of, we didn't have to worry about elves and stuff like that, so it had a completely unique fantasy feel to it. There were others. Things like, a gypsy who channeled the spirit of an insect man, an entomolian, they're called. This array that you get from the player characters. What if you had a draconian, one of these sort of impressive, fire-breathing, sorceress dudes, and who had, say, a barbarian and a corsair as the other player characters. The idea of this character with their, kind of rough and tough human buddies, particularly if they rolled something in their lifelines that put them at odds with their own culture, which is very likely. It's really you get that would be a much more brawly, fiery, more sword and sorcery looking situation. Granted, a little Hollywoody version of it, but that's cool, right? So, what does fantasy mean for the game? It really emerges from what array of player characters you have, and how and their individualization is really just going to drive. Okay, what then does it mean in terms of play itself? And long-term play like this is pretty unusual for the game. And you would think, given the character arcs that are very much set in place to take off, that you'd be really set for long-term play. And it is true that sort of that first arc, which in our case was about 7 sessions, really does kind of, crest and crash. In a good way, like Waves on the Rocks way. But there are a couple of difficulties. Difficulty number 1 is that for all of its coherence in terms of what it does say, the text is shockingly absent in anything the Game Master does actually to have an adventure. Things happen. Doesn't say a thing about working with the character's own individualizations, which is just bizarre. Considering that's exactly what the character creation does, and then there's just a 0 of what on earth you do with this in terms of making play. And the similar lacks involved add up to, almost not just absent, but what you might think of as a nothing burger, in the sense that since it's absent, you can kind of see the hole, almost to the point of saying, well, the mechanism that would fill that hole would be this. It would look like this. And still, it's not exactly clear enough just what that is. I think Ross really struggled with it, did his signal best to say this is about those arcs, and the NPCs that are there in the character stories, those are the active NPCs, and stuff is going to happen with them. And we will work with aspects of the setting that are invoked by where they are, which in our case was a place called Smith City. And we're going to work with that, and we're going to use the setting, for everything it's worth in terms of what could be going on there in terms of these contexts. And even so, I think Ross really found himself, struggling. The only thing that I can offer is that this game lives or dies by the proactivity of the NPCs. They can't just be up to something. They have to be doing it in the characters' faces. To the point where at the end, Ross was forced to do something, which was to sort of have a drop-in info dump NPC that may or may not, to him, have felt relatively artificial or forced. But it was really necessary. There just wasn't an organic way for things to click, for us to say, and now we're going to do X. So in many ways, our characters did a whole lot of dodging around and, rapscallious stuff across the landscape that probably left Ross, kind of clutching his forehead and going, will you just sit still for a second, so things can crash upon you. I think I know why, too.